When in the 1961 the Italian avant-garde artist Piero Manzoni situated the globe on a pedestal and proclaimed that from now on the world is a work of art, he did not anticipate the explosion of earth and land art that followed only a few years later. Although Manzoni's statement was absent from the conventional art historical accounts of the genesis of earth and land art, his gesture to the champion in terms of using a pre-existing object or a situation, his art anticipating conceptualism and arte povera, yet Manzoni's base points towards the very possibility that the earth, with all its environmental, ecological and political complexities, might become subject to artistic interventions and material of which to make art. It is impossible to come back to the 1960s and 70s land art, to the aesthetic categories, aspects of time, space, the sense of remoteness, and the human condition. As the French philosopher Henri Bergson convinces us in his critique of measurable time, the vibrating universe moves and changes restlessly, and our world, just as much as its art, inevitably changes with it. And yet in the digital or post-digital and post-internet and the many post-post eras in which we come to live, when not only the frame of knowledge but also the art categories are constantly being revised, land and environmental art retains a validity that asks our focused attention. And in this international summer school, Alps Art Academy, and its resulting exhibition, Art Safienthal, in Tenna, in the heart of Swiss Alps, aspires to revisit what does it mean in the cultural political landscape of today and in the vertical landscape of this region to make and to encounter land art. So in the following, I will really provide a brief historical overview over the tendencies of the 1960s and 70s that has challenged the idea, as you know, of art making, aesthetic categories and location. I will touch very briefly upon the notion of nature, location and site. And we'll see how we go. I have my 45 minutes, but we are running already late. So what was land art? Land art was a heterogeneous aggregation of artistic practices, as you all know, and strategies mostly key to the natural landscape. By locating itself literally and conceptually elsewhere, land art challenged the established perceptions of locality, objecthood, density, scale, flux and presence, and proposed an unprecedented conjunction of nature and culture. Romantic at the first sight, land art was a return to plein air par excellence, whether rural or urban. And you know, plein air, many of you know, French native speakers, plein air means outdoors, the kind of act of creating, of painting, which contrasted with the academism and the genre of studio painting ruling the previous centuries. It was enabled by the newly introduced transportable painting media, and it were the French and American Impressionists that are considered the proponents of this painting outdoors, often under umbrellas, white umbrellas to diffuse light. But unlike Impressionists who painted landscapes in situ, the landscapes of the 1960s became itself a medium, an artistic material. And this notion of the medium became destabilized by a turn away from the aesthetics of space and toward the social and cultural relations that these works evoke and enable. The art dealer Virginia Dwan, who was a mentor and supporter of many of the early land artists, claimed that for this artist the earth replaced the canvas. While Nancy Holt, for instance, turned to the mark-making in the landscape, emphasizing the land's spatial and temporal dimensions and enabling the viewers to see the vast landscapes of the desert through a new lens, and you see here, among other sand tunnels by her. Robert Morris explored the potentiality of a bulldozer and Michael Heiser of a caterpillar to become artistic tools. With a strong emphasis on materiality, and this is really a long-term fascination of mine, land art and landscape became thought to be needed, not represented, which metaphorically also stands for topological thinking and the post-structural idea of the fold evoked in the philosophical project of French philosophers Michel Serres and Gilles Deleuze. Here are a few main representatives, right, of land art. These are the conventional kind of, when you think about canonical land art, these figures pop up. And it's interesting that the narratives of art history are populated by American, right, quintessentially male white artists, Michael Heiser, Robert Smithson, Robert Morris, Dennis Oppenheim, and Walter de Maria, which are often seen also as colonizers of the American West. Such an account aligns closely with the historiography of art and reinforces the idea of the artist's genius with its roots in Vasari and culmination in Romanticism. I have here just an overview, a couple of slides, also with non-American representatives of this type of art. You recognize all of them here. But down here, it's of course the Running Fence by Crystal, Jean-Claude, and this work here by Richard Long. In fact, also numerous female artists were instrumental in the development of land art, and the recent art historical writing acknowledges just this. So Nancy Holt, as I mentioned earlier, was creating land art, and in contrast to her male peers, her mark-making on earth was orientated towards offering a device to view landscape, to scale it. Her best-known work is, of course, sand tunnels in the Great Basin of Utah, large concrete tubes that frame the sunset and sunrise during the summer and winter solstice. The perforation allows for viewing, projecting certain celestial constellations. We can see Draco, Perseus, Columba, and Capricorn inside the tubes. Here are just some other works by her, the ranch locators, which were actually dismantled shortly after they were created, and a reinstallation of this work in Avignon here, or one of the only two works of Nancy Holt, apparently, that I know of in Finland, in Pinslow, Up and Under. Agnes Dennis is another very interesting female figure, and I, deliberately kind of pay attention right at the beginning of this presentation to these figures, just also to pay tribute to them, but also due to the fact that they were for a long time kind of not very much appreciated, perhaps with the exception of Nancy Holt and to an extent Agnes Dennis. So Agnes Dennis moved to from Budapest to USA. She started as a painter and is considered the first artist to introduce ecological concerns in public art. She is known for her intervention Wheatfield, this one that you see here, A Confrontation, from 1982. The work was created in a vacant lot in Lower Manhattan. The artist cleaned the area, created a system of irrigation, planted 2 acres of wheat field, and harvested over 1,000 pounds of grain that she then distributed and exhibited in form of even a sort of art activism. Here is another very interesting female artist, Mary Meese. Her works are often kind of located close to public spaces, highlighting points of transitions in the landscape and rendering them points of contemplation and mediation. She's also well known from, of course, Rosalind Krauss' essay, The Sculpture in the Expanded Field, and I know that many of you discussed this during the past days. The sculpture becomes defined in this essay, but by what it is not. It is also interesting in the history of development, of conceptualization of this type of works. It is not landscape and not architecture. It is a combination of exclusions. It abandons the pedestal, right, the kind of modernist type of sculpture, which Krauss then refers to, I think, Rudolf Gates to Hall and Balzac. It is also the moment of transformation, from the modernist medium specificity, the separateness of mediums and specializations of the artist to the medium multiplicity. So Krauss defines, her medium in a quite kind of complex way. She said a medium becomes a set of operations in relation to cultural terms for which every medium could be used. For instance, photography, books, line on walls, mirrors, or sculpture itself is this kind of new medium. So it's interesting that this has been conceptualized in relation to Mary Mee's work, but also in relation to Alice Aycock's work. Here is Alice Aycock with her maze and a more aerial view. Sorry for the quality of the image that was only in this way available on the internet. But Alice Aycock, a Pennsylvania-born artist who created wells, tunnels, and labyrinths, cutting through the landscape and evoking the feeling of claustrophobia and exhilaration. The viewer, is forced to bring his or her body down to earth often, or, into the structures. He has to crawl or just find his way and negotiate the space between his or her body and the structure. Another artist, female artist, Ana Mendieta, here with Silhouetta series. She was Cuban-born, migrates to USA at the age of 18 and lived in a refugee camp. She is, of course, very known for her relation also to Carl Andre, right? The kind of conventional, again, narratives, who was accused of domestic abuse, and apparently her death was the kind of effect of domestic abuse. She falls from the 34th floor of the Greenwich Village apartment. But she creates these amazing works, which the series of Silhouetta very well represent here. These are earth body works which embed her body into the landscape. She covers her body, for instance, with blood, flowers, and feather, combining natural world and performance. And my just last mention of really great women artists who worked, with landscape is here Lita Albuquerque, and you know her already. We are really glad to have her with us this year. Her contribution, U.S. artist fascinated by moon landing, which she compares to the development, the importance of which she compares to the development of one point perspective in the Renaissance. Imagine this. So her works, in fact, really benefit from aerial views. And Stellar Axis, which you see here, she created in Antarctica in 2006. She addresses the alignment with celestial bodies and then their movement, which emphasizes the spatial and temporal shifts and the passing of time. Another of her work here is the Soul Star in the Giza Plateau. I think quite spectacular. So always already here. Some scholars actually maintain that the concerns with landscape and land intervention have been around for thousands of years. So this is, nothing really new. And I really like, I kind of was very inspired when we strive to look into the potential beginnings, because, the question that can be posed here, whether there are beginnings at all and what are the boundaries of, thinking about the history of human engagement with architecture, with landscape, or with this large-scale kind of creations. So some scholars maintain that the concerns with landscape and land intervention have been around for thousands of years, showcasing human courage toward the scale and demonstrating the power and beliefs, exercising the religions and exalting spatial imagination. So here to think only about the massive ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the stoic beauty of Giza, right? Which can be directly associated with Michael Heiser's The City, the work that is still in progress, and I bet we'll hear quite a lot about during the next days. It is also interesting that Heiser actually addresses this idea of awe. He says, it is interesting to build a sculpture that attempts to create an atmosphere of an awe, right? Awe is a state of mind for him, equivalent to religious experience. Also, the totem poles of British Columbia bear an association with something that some scholars associate with early kind of landscape interventions, like here the Konstantin Brancusi's Endless Tower. Another kind of perhaps inspiration or for many land artists, but also another sort of kind of historical engagement, very historical engagement of men with landscape are the Nazca lines here in Peru that are often associated with, again, Heiser circular surface. But I am just picking, projects and could talk about this in length. But for the time reasons, I have to constrain myself. So Heiser, for instance, here in circular surface planar displacement drawings is quite often associated with the drawings in the Peruvian deserts. Mayan astronomy observatories can be associated, again with James Turrell Roden crater, for instance, and also some scholars claim that that prehistoric or historic sources like this could also be sources for land art creations. Some acknowledge the first phenomena in the category of an aesthetic and utilitarian land interpretation as the prehistoric Stonehenge, right? The architectural, sophisticated decoding of the celestial and celestial happenings. And one last kind of, apparently only very far away association are the garden designs aligned here with Cartesian geometry in the 17th century France, for instance, like the Versailles, or 18th century British garden culture. It might also be seen as a form of land interpretation. So the shifting grounds of the concept of landscape in visual arts are convoluted. First, there is a relation of the landscape's pictorial representation contingent upon someone's looking at it to its becoming a medium to be worked with, and thus engaging the body of both the maker and the viewer. Second, there is a transition in the historical understanding of the word landscape. The scape in the landscape derives from the English word skype and is related to the word shape. The later word, skype, is used in the physical sense of shaping, which also implies a bodily engagement, as in the people shaping the land. Only later, landscape grew into its current sense of panoramic view. Evoking the feeling of the sublime, landscapes embodied the idea of greatness, endlessness, and the spiritual in art. This is actually a phrase taken from Kandinsky. Even later, the landscape became bound with changing social contexts, military conflicts, and cartographic measurements, and the questions of ownership and governance. Land induces the meaning of a home region, of a person or people, etymologically bound not only with the Earth's surface, but also with territory marked by political boundaries. And Oppenheim, USA-Canada traces such artificial political and temporal zones. On a different level, but addressing the territorial politics, Francis Alice, When Faith Moved Mountains from 2002, so pretty recent actually, exemplifies the symbolic power of human labor executed to move few centimeters of a sand dune in the outskirts of Lima during the dawn of Fujimori dictatorship in Peru. The scale and provocative character of wall paintings and graffiti, for instance, on the West Bank area might count as another example of art's critical engagement with the ideas of territoriality, even though not all of them, not all of these interventions were conceived as artistic. The constitution of landscape, as Alina Williams writes, is bound not only to the physicality of the earth, but also to the physiology and psychology of the viewer. Landscapes combine the physical, geological origins and the cultural overlay of human presence. As a part of vital synthesis of peoples and place, they are crucial for the establishment of local and national identity. Working on the land and shaping the land renders us farmers. Our culture, maintains Serre, is our agriculture. Today it is impossible to discuss land art without its ecological implications, of course. Radically transformed contemporary landscapes, global warming, pollution, and exploitation of resources forces us to reconsider the categories of the sublime, the quality of greatness beyond the possibility of calculation, right? The beauty and romanticism that for a considerable time were associated with the historic land art. We entered a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, for many at least of us this is true, which stands for the realization of the human imprint on the geological strata in glaciers, rocks, oceans and sediments in long duration. Mankind as a dominant geological force has caused an acceleration of this development marked by the massively increased global population, exponential exploitation of fossil fuels, atomic bomb and carbon dioxide and methane gas levels. While the classic modernist demarcations between culture and nature, urban and rural, interior and the exterior, subject and object, and natural and artificial have gradually begun to dissolve, new landscape formations emerged, not least caused by the global environmental exploitation. What earlier was kept apart and conceptualized separately, now technology, nature, and man blur to become modified state of being. In its discursive and physical dimension, land art cannot be thought apart from nature, the integral essentialism of the natural world. Ether and matter and natural processes is a synecdoche for nature, a kind of metonymy. Connoted in this way, land art is a construct of nature and culture, the former often seen in contradistinction to the latter. Culture being a fluid and artificial concept built by social, economic, and political forces. The idea of nature as the elusive originary other, something that we are native to and yet separated from, continues to be present in today's understanding. The contemporary criticism is critical of the perception of land art as wish to return to the land and nature and aesthetic nativism. Rather, land art is often considered as a critical engagement with the terms of artistic mediation, whether organized around institutions or forms of media. What occurs less apparent is that the concept of nature itself has changed, right, since the 1960s. It's really nothing stable. Once vast and inexhaustible, nature has transformed to imperiled and fragile, reflecting the health of the planet. The traditional metaphor for nature as primordial garden became obsolete for the landscape were human interventions, disruptions, and transmutations. The role of the land art artist in transforming the perception of nature remained invaluable, although also non-unproblematic. The somewhat gigantic scale and those, for instance, a few of Heiser project with a certain invasiveness and brutality, to name only this one here, the Munich Depressions or Bern Depression, created on the occasion of the attitude became formed, or the double negative created on Mormon Mesa of Moapa Valley in Nevada. From the art historical theoretical perspective, land art of the 1960s and 70s responds to a different, socio-political conditions and varies from land art in that it engages, land art in that it engages with a different sort of medium. While it might be said that historic land art emerged from the expanded field of sculpture and the practices of minimalism, and I mentioned it already in relation to Krause's essay, among others, today's artistic practices of, for instance, Carsten Höller, Lucrezia Ravenigia, Pierre Ouche, or or other artists such as Lara Almashegui, and we hope to hear about her more today, and I hope to pronounce her name properly. I will hear more, probably more proper pronunciations. These practices involve an expanded cross-disciplinary field, including perspectives of social worker, geographer, anthropologist, experimental architect, or activist. Archivist actually sounds also quite relevant. So the still present aesthetics or the lure of the remote gives way to the interpretation which takes place on the intersection of curatorial and artistic cultures. And these cultures, I think, mark also the interpretation of human interaction with the surface of Earth. And I am really kind of impressed and I'm a huge admirer of the Center for Land Use Interpretation, CLUI, with its basis in Los Angeles, which is, I think, a prominent example of this kind of cross-sections between curatorial and artistic practices and the sort of projects that combine, projects that are devoted both to artistic practices and to human land interpretation. We'll hear more about this from Steve, so I'm just not going into this. It is important to note that, for its dependence on site and grounded in the authenticity of one's first-hand experience of it, land art emerged hand in hand with installation art, right? Informed by Zen gardens, spectacles. This is, I'm lagging behind. Center for Art, Land Use Interpretation. And here is the inspiration for land art, perhaps, the early land art, and the association between, land art and early, perhaps, installation art that emerged, that perhaps share, common genealogies. So Zen gardens here, spectacles, 18th and 19th centuries panoramas, also panoramas, right? Wunderkammern, cabinets of curiosity, and arte povera. Another aspect shared by these two distinct and heterogeneous phenomena is their site sensitivity or site specificity. In addition, land art arose in the time of the nascent conceptualist and early media art for its ability to create and to represent. Media art conjures a coexistence of the mediated artwork with the physical artwork. The conceptual artwork's perseverance is inextricably linked with the potentiality of its transmission and dissemination through the means of film, video, and broadcast technologies. It might be said that conceptualism, in order to acknowledge the existence of an artwork in the sphere of an idea, relies to a degree on the same logic of mediation and mediatization, with the former to become central topoi of land art. The momentum for land art occurred during the rise of environmentalism, feminist movement, and decentralized political strategies in response to the globalization of electronic and cultural technology, mass war, nuclear threats, and repressive economies. Land art surfaces in the decade that witnessed the first human space travel, here is Yuri Gagarin in 1961, and moon landing in 1969, enterprises that presented views of the globe from above, scaling out of the human dimension to enable imagining Earth as an object. Whereas the open space offered no limitations, the Berlin Wall began to segregate West and East Berlin. West and East Berlin became a powerful symbol of the Cold War. The 1960s present themselves as an era of contradictions. First satellites promised the freedom of global communication, reassured by Marshall McLuhan's canonic 1967 canonic proclamation, "The medium is the message." But at the same time, the Cuba crisis frightens with the proximity of global nuclear catastrophe. the brutal Vietnam War breaks out in 1964 and is followed by a giant wave of protest. Though it is not only the dialectic of the inside and outside worlds, the confidence in progress flanked by the fear, but also of the pace and the slowness of time that concerned artists in 1960s. Time in the 1960s felt different. There was generally the perceptible acceleration of life in all its aspects on the one hand, while on the other, a nostalgia for a simpler, more natural existence in remote places, away from urban centers and civilizations. In her book Chronophobia, Hanna Hölling posits that we might in fact still live in the aftermath of this decade. She contends the 60s are endless, we still live within them. Not only do we live within them as a matter of historical reckoning, of grappling with the trauma of Vietnam War, the afterlife of the counterculture, and the continued relevance of the decade's liberation movements, rather the 60s are endless in staging endlessness as a cultural phenomenon, as she says, of revealing in the long shadows cast by its technological entropy a vision of the future ever quickening and repeating. This technological entropy, just as geological entropy, gnaws on the idea of an eternal work created to resist decay, alteration, and obsolescence. So where can we locate the origins, right, of land art? And I already told you that actually there are very different visions regarding this. But many art historians provide the origins of the kind of early origins of land art in the activities of the Japanese Gutai group, for instance, especially Kazuo Shiraga, who incorporated earth and mud into his violent performances in the early 1950s, or his landsman Isamu Noguchi, and many of you are familiar with these amazing mock-ups which were never realized. Noguchi, who created a maquette presenting a massive relief of human face that was to be seen from the space. Already by the end of the 1950s, the German artist Hans Mack drafted project which incorporated light in the Sahara Desert. It was realized a little bit later in 1962-63. The German also Fernsehgalerie Gary Schum, which is the TV gallery, was the first to introduce land art as a term in the title of Schum's film from 1969. After seeing Earth Art exhibition organized at Cornell University in 1969, earlier, which was claimed to be the first show really on the topic and was only preceded by Smithson Earthworks, Schum set off to compile contributions of all involved artists in the medium of film for the German television. And it's really interesting because this interest of Schum's, in immediacy were crucial for the type of his creative output. For him, television broadcasting and video recording enable a direct contact between the artist and the public. Using the medium of television, the artist whom he filmed, could reduce his work to a concept, attitude, or gesture. Schum was not only a curator and producer of the program, but also assumed a role of a mediator between the TV broadcast and the artist. These beginnings of land art suggest from the very outset a strong reliance of this form of mediation and its subsequent mediatization, which I already mentioned. This history reconfirms the interdependence of media and land art, and also conceptualism present in the overtones of Schum's vision. Simultaneously, I think there is also this kind of marking of the media arts and land arts common beginnings, especially, in Schum's project. Often the term land art, earthworks, and earth art tend to be used interchangeably, classifying the two latter as subsets of land art. Historically seen, however, land art was connoted with European origins. The earthwork surfaced in the title of the exhibition organized by Virginia Dwan and curated by Smithson in New York Dwan Gallery in 1968. Devoid of the iconography of ecology, which began to be kind of bound with later land art, the artworks presented in this exhibition, the earthworks, had only one common denominator. They incorporated earth as material. Objects, drawings, blueprints, sculptures, photographs, and film, and a painting presented a conglomeration of artifacts that became a characteristic of land art heterogeneous range. Carl André and Saint-Louis showed documentation of their works executed externally, while Smithson added photographs documentation to his non-sites, a new concept of an object destined for a gallery but originating on the site of the excavation. The non-site is a sort of quotation, a physical and conceptual transposition of the real external site and a reformulation of optical mechanisms. It is a dialectic of different realities, the interior and the exterior, the here and the there. The second seminal exhibition was titled Earth Art, and it was curated in 1969 and organized at the Cornell University by Willoughby Sharp. Perhaps an inspiration for the Seaman later, perhaps it was also an inspiration for the Seaman later exhibition, Life in Your Head. This is still Earth Art at Cornell, and this is here, Life in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form. And you know already that this has been revived and reenacted in LA after the acquisition of by the Getty of the Seaman archive, and also it's on view in Bern, which is not quite not this exhibition, but Harald Seaman kind of oeuvre and his other exhibition, which is titled, I think, Son of the Grandfather or so. So just in case you have more time after this, after Abstract Gallery, to have a look at Swiss exhibitions. So so Life in Your Head actually included many international artists, such as Jan Dibets from the Netherlands, Hans Acker, and Günther Uecker from Germany, Richard Long also from Great Britain. So recent scholarship and curatorial projects attempt to debunk a few preconceptions about land art, and these are mostly related to the location of land art and its relation to the institutions and media. I rely here largely on the argument also of Milan Kwon and Philip Kaiser, which was put forward in the book and exhibition Ends of Art from 2012. So firstly, unlike it was often reiterated, land art never existed entirely in isolation, in uncultivated and natural landscapes such as the deserts or the woods. Instead, they claim land art must be considered not in contradiction, but in relation to the city and to the urban. Secondly, land art was not only a phenomenon that developed in American landscape. Thirdly, land art did not develop outside the art system, outside the space of the gallery, and away from the media. We know this already. I've shown it in my former slides. So European and British land artists, and I have just included the slides very quickly, so I'm sorry that I don't have the full titles. European and British artists such as Hans Mack, Richard Long, Jan Dibets, Hans Hacker, and others conceived of their projects outside the American deserts. Another preconception perhaps concerns the aspect of the remoteness, right, of land art. While it is true that to encounter major works, land art works, require a long trip through the desert of the southwest, perhaps, this journey should not be mistaken for land art's moving out of the art system. As Kaiser and Kwon remark in The Ends of Earth and Back, land art develops squarely with this context and provoked their transformation. Land art never existed outside the art system and media. Land art films, photographs, props, and leftovers secured its functioning in the gallery and art system through the potent presence of media. Popular journalism provided its vivid convergence for general readership and propagated some of the assumptions about land art, its grand scale, remoteness, relation to nature, and challenges in making. Land art was often produced for media and also produced by the media. Taking this into consideration, a question arises whether land art might have been produced without the media in the first place. The process of making land art went hand in hand with the process that ensured that it remained noticed. Just a few remarks on the site. Land artworks create a relation to site as one of its most significant aspects. Site specificity, according to Kwon, used to imply something grounded, bound to the laws of physics. After playing with gravity, site-specific works used to be obstinate about presence, even if they are materially ephemeral and adamant about immobility, even in the face of disappearance or destruction. Site in land art is a tangible reality and a location which identity is constructed by a combination of physical elements, proportions, scale, texture, lighting condition, topographical features, and traffic patterns. In contrast to self-referential, autonomous, and transportable modernist sculpture standing on the plinth, which I already mentioned, land art created in the aftermath of minimalism was formally directed or determined by site and its environmental context. Whether in the desert or in a public space, land art evoked a reciprocity between artwork and space. Rather than being a backdrop against which the work was exhibited, the spatial context constituted a land artwork. Critic Rosalind Deutscher relegates this phenomenon to the late modernism and emerging post-minimalism, naming it an aesthetic strategy in which context was incorporated into the work itself. The contingencies of the context, rather than the object, began to bear the meaning. And I would say, I would have for you an example of a really very interesting site-specific work that was removed from an urban center, which problematizes the question of, work's reliance on space. But I will move on for the sake of time. The relation of land art, also, just a quick mention to site, is strongly emphasized by Smithsonian dialectic. I will turn back to this one. Smithsonian dialectic of the outdoor and indoor manifests in the invention of non-sites, which I already mentioned, and as displaced fragments of actual sites exhibited in galleries. In a discussion conducted with art historian Anne Wagner, both Smithson and Oppenheim dispute the concept related to this dialectic. It is clear that, while the work is outside, there are always areas of fusion that allow for coming back to the space of the gallery, to its interior. Site and space cannot be discussed without the viewer and the experience of it, his or her being within the site and his or her observation of the site. The understanding of sites and locations imply the presence of vision and the necessity to address the ocular aspect of land art. This aspect is bound with the centrality of ocular sensation, the eye. Another aspect of land art is the empirical topographic understanding of the site or site. De Maria, in requiring the viewer being in the work, here is the lightning fields with this, amazing lightning, which apparently not always, it's not kind of necessary part of the experience of the work, as many suggest. The Maria, in requiring the viewer being in the work, set up a set of rules and conditions that enable an undistracted viewing with the viewer as a participant in an arranged and strictly determined experiencing of the site. And there is this 24 hours overnight visit, including a transportation from neighboring village that you have to kind of subject yourself to in order to view the work. This somewhat forceful positioning of the viewer within the created work and his prescribed prescribed participation was subject to criticism by the proponents of free encounters with and discernment of the site. Site and space relate also to the way in which objects are situated within them. Objects may occupy space, but can also frame space. In Holzhof, which I already mentioned, this framing is strongly emphasized. Sand tunnels are not only interventions in the landscape, but are framing devices. A prolonged contemplation of the site elicits longer duration of experience, so necessary to grasp the work and the sense of the place it inhabits. Land art, and this is my last remark, I promise, land art no doubt elicits the concept of time. Not only time passing, which with the development of measurement of technologies became quantifiable and was substituted for units and numbers. Time in land art is linked with the movement of the universe, the cyclicality of the movement of celestial spheres, for instance, as in Holt or in Turel. The time of decay, erosion and degradation, as in Heiser here, or in Smithson, the ephemeral, this is still Smithson, and this is still Heiser, the ephemeral, as in Oppenheim and De Maria, and the dialectic of the past and present, as for instance in Smithson and Heiser. For Smithson, time is crucial to the notion of entropy and biological evolution. It is time passed, according to Lynn Cook, I quote, in the guise of geology, paleontology, crystallography, and entropy. Smithson, who was perhaps the most articulate among the land artists, asserts, I quote, time is always there, gnawing at us and corroding all our best intentions and all our most beautiful thoughts about where we think we are at. It is always there, like a plaque creeping in, but occasionally we try to touch on some timeless moment, and I suppose that it is what art's about to a degree, lifting oneself out of that continuum. His writing often circulates around the idea of monuments, old and new, ruins in reverse, as he says, evoking reflections of time and temporality. Entropy as a condition that is irreversible contradicts, according to Smithson, the usual notion of mechanistic worldview. The crystals of spiral jetty, here's spiral jetty actually again with Heiser for some reason, but if you just concentrate on the left hand slide, the crystals of spiral jetty prove a crystalline structure of time, one that builds up a material sediment, additive, accumulative, and opaque, and prevents a return to the past. In a voice-over to his film Asphalt Rundown, he looks at Marcel Duchamp's scattered glass as an example of entropy, which renders the return to the original state impossible. Instead, for instance, for Nancy Holt, time in the desert takes on a physical presence. It is measured in the ageless rocks in the distance and the realization of curvature of the earth when one walks over the Bonneville Salt Flats rather than in mathematical abstraction. This experience evokes a sense of being on the earth, as Holt puts it, and rotating space, a universal time. The temporality of works such as spiral jetty, double negative, and lightning fields is linked with their changing conditions. What is perceived as a particular state is in reality a series of interpermeating states that follow each other in succession, a constant flux. It is a restless duration, a movement of reality, as suggested by Bergson, which the human perception condenses into images, a sort of snapshots views, a denaturation of transition. Another imprint of time is exposed in the trenches of double negative. It is a geological time, the accumulation of sedimentary rocks created through the process of constant geological movement, disclosed as a series of relaxations and consolidations. Each layer contains further layers articulating the accumulation of time in visible, spatial, and different than linear dimensions. Such geological time coexists with and is constituted by the human time and the organic time. And perhaps a really nice point of contact between, archaeology and anthropology here. This image also demonstrates that the landscape, as the world in which we stand, is perpetually under construction, a work in progress, and time in continuous slow duration. And it is with this work in progress that I am leaving you now, and toward which I am looking during this edition of Alps Arts Academy and Art Safintime. And I thank you so much for your attention.